Hey everyone, RK here, and welcome back to the Pioneers of Bitcoin podcast. Today I'm joined by Benjamin Cohen from Into the Cryptoverse. Benjamin comes from a heavy quantitative background. He studied mathematics, went on to do a master's and PhD in nuclear engineering, spent time working with NASA, and first got interested in Bitcoin back in 2011 through a cryptography class. These days, he's well known for his data-driven, micro-focused view on the market. In this episode, we talk almost entirely about one thing: where Bitcoin really is in this cycle right now and what that could mean for the price in the short and long term. We look at how this move compares to previous cycles like 2019 and 2022, the similarities in price action, sentiment and liquidity, and the key differences that might change how this one plays out. We also dig into the recent drawdown, and Ben breaks down what he thinks actually drove that move and what he's watching next for confirmation of the next big trend. Then we zoom out and I ask him for his 4-year view on Bitcoin, his base case, bull case, and bear case for price, and how he thinks about positioning through all of that. If you're trying to understand where Bitcoin might go from here, both in the coming months and over the next cycle, then this conversation is for you. Here's my interview with Benjamin Cohen. How you been, Ben? All good?
Yep, doing pretty well.
Perfect. Amazing. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for taking the time to come on the show. I have been watching your content, and especially recently because of this conversation, I wanted us to go through many topics that you usually talk about, especially about the Bitcoin price action recently and everything that's been happening around the markets. But let's maybe start with a little bit of your background, if you don't mind. I've seen in your channel that you don't only talk about Bitcoin, you also talk about precious metals, you talk about even altcoins and all sorts of things. And I know that you have a quant background. I was just wondering if you can just very briefly talk about your background, what you did before you started your channel and your company, obviously, Into the Cryptoverse.
Sure. Yeah, again, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I think, yeah, I studied mathematics for my undergrad degree. Back in, I started in like 2008. So I guess a good time to be in school and not be in the job market. So I did that for 4 years, and I actually did an internship at NASA Johnson Space Center. I also was up at Virginia. In Virginia at NASA Langley. I taught like some space and science camps up in Virginia Beach through NASA to like kids. uh, and then I guess like my junior year, I think it was junior year, so it would have been 2011. I took a cryptography class as part of an elective for my math degree, and that was kind of when I first got interested in crypto in general. And for me, the interest more so stemmed from like an academic interest related to cryptography. Um, that was kind of where my interest stemmed from back in 2011. And so then I went to grad school. I did I did a master's and then a PhD in nuclear engineering. I got more interested in Bitcoin throughout grad school and made all the mistakes that you can make. And then I graduated my PhD. My dissertation, for anyone who cares, was on radiation damage in ceramics using molecular dynamics and in situ transmission electron microscopy. So it was a mix of like experiments and simulations. I then ended up doing a postdoc at one of the national labs. And while I was doing my postdoc, I just given a presentation. I just presented my research at a conference in Portland, Oregon. It was a high energy density physics conference. And then right after I presented my work, I then went up to my hotel room and then I recorded my first YouTube video. Um, and that
Year was that?
what?
Which year was that?
2019.
2019. Okay. Was that about Bitcoin? What your first video, or what was it about?
It was not about Bitcoin. I honestly couldn't tell
Okay.
you. Some of the first videos I did were on Ethereum, but I don't know exactly. It was probably on. I mean, I don't even think I have them on my channel anymore because the quality was like so bad. Like I was, and I that's saying something for me because I don't really pride myself on having too high quality, but like the you could basically hear the fan from the laptop just running like nonstop during the video. So it was probably about some altcoin, if I had to guess. But yeah, I mean that was back in 2019. I launched the channel, and it was more just academic. Like I was just like, all right, I want to like talk. I want to show some charts that you can't really see on TradingView. Um, and yeah, I mean, so I did that, and then I started into the cryptoverse in 2020, and then I still worked my day job, my real job, that I worked my entire life for. I still worked it until 2021, and then I quit. I was no longer a postdoc. I was a scientist, like a senior member of the technical staff, and then I quit because into like my brand here was growing, and I couldn't really. I knew I wouldn't be able to do both, and do a good job at both. So then I quit my day job and then just started doing this stuff full time. And so that's kind of how I ended up here.
And what was the most fascinating part about Bitcoin that dragged you into the space? Was it the cryptography part? Was it like the technical part of it, or which part was it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mean it definitely wasn't the price part at first. It was more so like the um, it's decentralized, which I thought was pretty cool. I mean, remember, a lot of this was, I mean, Bitcoin was essentially born out of the financial crisis, right? Um, and I think the decentralization part was cool. I think just the ability to like, you can't just print more of it was really interesting to me. Like, obviously, just because you can't print more of something doesn't inherently give it value. Like, I have a certain limited supply of my toenails, but that doesn't mean they're valuable, right? Um, but I think that gave me some interest as well. Obviously having like a ledger that you could see everything was kind of cool because then you can actually track things in a way that you can't track other assets. Like the on-chain part of it is just really really interesting to me. Um, which is funny because had Bitcoin been designed with more privacy features, like that wouldn't even necessarily be as much of a thing. Uh, but it was. I mean, there are coins that have that, but you know, that wasn't for Bitcoin. You can track you can trace everything. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think that all that stuff kind of, contributed to my interest, and then of course, I think my interest stayed long term because like the price started going up, right? I mean, like if I was interested in Bitcoin and then the price went to say like $10 and I got excited about it, and then it just went to zero, like I don't think I'd still be talking about it, Obviously, like the price has I mean, it's sort of like a validation of like why that stuff was actually interesting and it was important and it was valuable to other people. So I feel like the price going up for so many years kind of helped validate that view.
Sure. I mean, Bitcoin wouldn't have any monetary value if it didn't have any price, right? I mean, it's eating into the current monetary system, so it has to have a price. Otherwise, it would be a useless blockchain or even network, to simplify it. Okay, very interesting. See, I have prepared, as I said, a few questions after going through all of, not all, you have a lot of content online, but just a few recent of your content videos. I've been through them, but I've also seen some of your previous comments because I was watching you, for example, when the altcoiners were coming out and they were saying, "Yeah, the altcoin season is coming," and you were dashing on them all the time, and you're pointing out to all of your. And by the way you do it is actually quite fascinating to me because you stay very very rational, and you don't actually show much emotion when you talk about this stuff. So I think this sits very, very well on a lot of people. That's why people really like the content that you produce. So why do you think haven't we seen an altcoin season this cycle? Why do you think that is?
So, one of the things I spend a lot of time talking about, and again, like it's not about, I think a lot of people sort of misunderstand. They're like, oh, Ben doesn't want an alt season to happen. He wants us, he wants our coins to go to zero, like he's against us. But I mean, it has nothing to do with any of that stuff, right? It was more so just me learning from my own past mistakes. And so this chart right here is total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. So it shows you like the collective valuation of altcoins against Bitcoin. And what you'll notice is that, they tend to top out at around parity with Bitcoin, maybe a little bit more, where the market cap of altcoins is essentially equivalent to the market cap of Bitcoin, right? But all altcoins, not just a few of them, like all altcoins. And then you can see that they've also tended to bottom out at around 25% of Bitcoin's market cap, right? So there's a long time through here where people like kept calling for alt season, you know, and I'm just like, guys, look, like I used to think the same thing back in 2019, but it wasn't until alt Bitcoin pairs were approximately worth 25, or when altcoins were worth 25% of Bitcoin's value, it wasn't until then that you even had the right conditions for an alt season, you know? Furthermore, we have to recognize that Bitcoin, while this cycle feels very much the same, in a lot of different ways. Like if you actually look at the ROI from the low for Bitcoin, and you compare, say, like this cycle to the last two cycles, I mean, this cycle lasted, assuming the top is in, this cycle lasted 1,062 days. And last cycle lasted 1,059, and then the cycle before that lasted 1,067. So like in a lot of ways, this cycle is exactly the same as the last two cycles, just with diminishing returns. Where it's different is the fact that Bitcoin, this is Bitcoin's price, color coded by social interest. This time, Bitcoin topped on apathy rather than euphoria. So in 2017 and 2021, we had euphoria, and therefore we had an alt season. If you look at the raw values of the social interest, you can see in 2017 it was generally going up. And in 2020 and 2021, it was generally going up before the alt season even occurred. But in 2023, 2024, and 2025, it's just been trending down, right? Like it never truly started trending up where it was putting in higher lows and higher highs. And so when you color code this again, like it doesn't really look like the 2021 top or the 2017 top. It looks more like the 2019 top, where Bitcoin found that top on apathy. Now, what's interesting is when you realize that Bitcoin topped on apathy and not euphoria, and you go look for what are similarities between, say, this current top and the one we had back in 2019, is that in 2019, Bitcoin topped approximately 2 months before quantitative tightening ended, right? And so you could argue that the exact same thing just happened, right? Like where Bitcoin found this local top about 2 months before QT, quantitative tightening, came to an end. And so a lot of people, sat around waiting for, they're like, oh, like QE is coming, and it's going to lead to an alt season and whatnot. But the reality is that when all Bitcoin pairs bottomed last cycle, it was when the balance sheet started to go up, right? It was when the balance sheet started to go up. But even though they bottomed against Bitcoin, they still bled against the US dollar, because then Bitcoin started to drop, right? So they bottomed against Bitcoin when the balance sheet started increasing right here. But because Bitcoin was going down, like alts went up against Bitcoin, but they went down against the US dollar. So, a lot of people at first were like, oh, well, alts are never going to go that low against Bitcoin again. And they thought I was crazy for suggesting it. But then it got to the point where they're like, all right, now whenever they hit these levels, that's when alt season happens. But remember, in the last cycle, when they first hit the range lows, that did not correspond to an all season, right? That's just when they bottomed against Bitcoin for a while. So you could argue that like we're in this phase, like somewhere in here right now, where like all Bitcoin pairs are going down, and they might end up bottoming out within the next few weeks, few months. If you actually include um USDC onto this chart, you'll see that that wick we had in October already got us down to 0.25. So you could already argue that we've gone to the range lows. But again, just because you go to the range lows doesn't necessarily immediately imply that, like that it's alt season, right? Like, it doesn't imply that at all. It just implies that altcoins are near the end of their bleed against Bitcoin. And the reason for that, the reason why they're nearing that end collectively, is more than likely because of looser monetary policy that we're about to get. So again, it's a long process. Remember the last cycle after alt Bitcoin pairs hit the range lows 1 month after QT ended, we didn't get an alt season for a year and a half, right? Like it was a year and a half later. So I think a lot of people just they really got ahead of themselves, and they weren't really looking at what the charts were. So they were only looking at it through like what happened last cycle with altcoins, but not really taking into account like the monetary policy and how the macro affects the markets.
So it looks like you look a lot on the charts, obviously, the historic charts. My next question, I think you answered it already, was about the difference between this cycle. So you believe that cycle or the cycle top has been in for this cycle?
I think I would say there's probably like a 75% chance that the cycle top is in. Um, and yeah, I mean, that's what I think. It doesn't mean it's in for everything. Like there are scenarios where if Bitcoin were to rally up to a lower high, then you could see some cryptocurrencies put in higher highs. Like that's a pretty normal thing to occur. So I'm not saying like that can't occur. It absolutely could, but I feel like I'm certainly leaning towards the cycle top being in at this point. Um, if Bitcoin were to sweep the low and go below 75K, that would be the best opportunity for a relief rally. So if we're gonna put in another all-time high, my guess is that it would be after going below 75K, and then it'd be like a really strong move after that. I think you could have a move after that, but I'm kind of in the camp of it resulting in a lower high and then going down into the 200-week moving average by the summer of 2026.
Is around what price? The 200
It's
weekly
approaching
moving average?
it's approaching 60K, but it'll be somewhere between 60 or 70K. What's really interesting is if you actually compare this site, like if you actually look at, let me share my screen again. Um so if we actually compare like this bear market, if we say that we're in a bear market, which obviously not everyone agrees with, but like if we say we're in a bear market, what if instead of being in like a 2022 bear market or a 2018 or a 2014, what if we're in like that 2019 style bear market, where we topped on apathy rather than euphoria? And if you look at that bear market and you compare it to the one today, it's almost tracking it perfectly, right? You can just see that slow bleed. Um, it's not a massive immediate 50% crash like we got in 2018. It's just a slow, methodical bleed, and I think, within a few months, um, that could come to an end. It doesn't necessarily mean it's over. I mean, we did get a bigger drop later on, but that was caused by a pandemic. And I think it's silly to assume that you're going to have like a pandemic induced recession again. It doesn't mean you can't have a recession, but I'm kind of tracking this right now. So I'm looking for, kind of a slow bleed, a counter trend rally, probably sometime early 2026, that'll then ultimately go into a lower low. And then I'm guessing that this low right here, you can see from 2019, it was about a 50% drop from the high, that 0.5. It went about 50% down. So if you take Bitcoin from the high and you go down 50%, that basically puts you between 60 and 70K. Um, and so yeah, that's kind of what I'm leaning towards right now. And also, you can see that 200-week moving average is already at 56K, 56 and a half. So you give that a few more months, and you're going to have the 200-week moving average, at that's those same prices, like 60K all the way up to like say 70K, depending on how late it takes into 2026 to hit it. So yeah, that's my base case.
Follow-up question on that, because you say it's a slow bleed. What do you say to a counter argument that we actually had not a slow very slow movement, but a very quick and fast movement. Because just a few months ago, it was just over 2 months ago, we were at all-time highs.
So if you look at the QT ending, like if you look at the bear markets that started around when QT ended, like Bitcoin's like this cycle, it's actually below that ROI from the peak. And that was kind of a slow bleed. But if you compare it to the other bear markets, like if you take the ROI after the cycle peak, if you look at the prior bear market, so this is the current cycle, this purple line's the current cycle. Last cycle, it looked like that. So at this point, last cycle, Bitcoin was already down, like almost 50% from the high, right? Whereas right now, it's not even down 40% from the high. If you look at the cycle before that one, you can see that by this point, Bitcoin had already retraced over 60% from the high. And then the cycle before that, at this point, it had already retraced more than 50% from the high before bouncing. So that's why this is more a slow bleed, because it did not have that initial massive capitulation of 50%, which is usually what happens near cycle tops. That occurs a lot faster, right? Like look at 2017, 2018, you had a very big drop really early on. Same thing over here in 2014, right? But we haven't had that. It's been a slower bleed, which I think resembles more so that 2019 style top. If you actually take a bar pattern here, maybe even late 2021 as well, if you take a bar pattern here and you just kind of like overlay it, I mean, it seems like it matches up a lot more than something like from 2018, where it was a more parabolic rally followed by a much larger dump.
Yeah. Uh, Ben, you use a lot of data, obviously, and charts to project your thesis, and obviously that's a valid way to do it. But let me ask you a different kind of question. I'm not sure if anybody has asked you this before. What do you say to those who say we actually did have an altcoin season, but it was different this time? It was an alt season in Bitcoin treasury companies.
I mean, yeah, I mean you could say that there's been different interests for sure. Um, and I have to some degree, like just to speak candidly, I don't even know if I've said this before, but like to speak candidly about some of the treasury companies, like a lot of them will sort of like pride themselves. A lot of the people that run them would sort of pride themselves on always being like anti altcoins and all this other stuff, because they talk about altcoins being down like 90 something percent and how they're not great investments. Yet so many of these treasury companies are down more than 95% now, right? So like there is a valid argument.
Naka.
What?
Like
I'm
Naka.
not ma- I'm not getting into the names. But my point is like what it shows you is that like people can put a different name on it, but it doesn't mean
Yeah.
it's not ultimately bleeding to Bitcoin, right? So I feel like a lot of people were anti-alts because they're like, oh well, this bleeds to Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is the superior thing. And then they go launch a treasury company that also, by the way, bleeds to Bitcoin. I mean, even the miners bleed to Bitcoin, right? Like even everything in crypto over a long enough period of time will likely end up bleeding to Bitcoin, right? And that's the reality. And the only thing that changes is that people get more creative with how they extract liquidity from participants and how they convince them to not put their money in Bitcoin, but to put it in something else that ends up leading to Bitcoin, right? So I feel like a lot of them were able to, convince people, convince themselves, all right, well, I don't want to do it in altcoins. But now some of these treasury companies are down more than some of the altcoins are. And I mean, that's a problem, right? I think that's a problem. And so, I mean, I'm not saying like that they're the reason there wasn't an alt season. I don't think we had an alt season just because we've been in higher for longer interest rate and quantitative tightening. And in 2019, we didn't have an alt season then either when Bitcoin topped out during that regime of monetary policy. So, like, I get the argument, but I would also say that even if the treasury companies had not existed, I still don't think there would have been an alt season.
Okay. So the Bitcoin dominance metric, there's been a lot of critique about it because there is always more altcoins in the space. Um, you use it a lot for good reason because people want to talk about it all the time and people want to know if there is anything other than Bitcoin to outperform Bitcoin in the short term. But when do you think is the time where we can say, okay, this metric is not even relevant anymore?
I think it is relevant. Like, I mean, I think there's been like a I think there's been this idea that people think that it's not relevant just because there's like infinitely more of the altcoin market. But I think the reality is like, you can print a million more altcoins, but it doesn't mean the liquidity going into those altcoins is any more, right? You're just spreading liquidity thinner and thinner. If there's 10 people and nine of them want to buy Bitcoin and one of them want to buy altcoins, the nine people are going to buy Bitcoin regardless. And if you print 10 more altcoins, it just means that one person putting the money into altcoins just has to then pick which altcoin they put it into. So the liquidity gets spread thinner and thinner. So I think Bitcoin dominance is still important despite more altcoins. I think the reason it's not higher than it is because the stablecoin market, right? The stablecoin market is makes up a significant portion of it now. And in the past, I think you could argue that Bitcoin sort of only within crypto it represented the flight to safety. Whereas now the flight to safety can be Bitcoin, but it can also be USDT, USDC, other stablecoins as well. So that's kind of influenced it. But the reality is like, regardless of the amount of altcoins that were created, I mean, think about it like this. Think about it, how many hundreds of thousands of altcoins have been created um, over the last couple of years. And despite that, in 2022, Bitcoin dominance put in a higher low compared to 2017, 2018, right? So with all the money printing, with all the VC money coming in, with interest rates at zero, and the fact that stablecoins made up a higher percentage of the market cap in 2021 than they did in 2017. Despite all that, Bitcoin dominance still put in a higher low, right? So that tells you that Bitcoin is reclaiming more market share, right? Like it is. It's not going lower like a lot of people thought. It's actually going higher. And if you look at any individual altcoin, every individual altcoin over a long enough period of time, well, most of them bleed against Bitcoin. So if individual altcoins bleed against Bitcoin, then why wouldn't we expect the collective altcoin market to bleed against Bitcoin, which means eventually Bitcoin dominance should continue to go higher.
Do you think they're a net positive for Bitcoin and the entire space?
Altcoins?
Yes.
I mean, I think most of them are scams. Um, I'm not saying all of them are, but I think like 99.999% of them are just cash grab scams. Obviously the Bitcoin maxi view is that they're all scams. Um, but I mean, maybe I'm just naive or ignorant, but I choose to believe that there's at least a few people out there that are trying to build something, and they're not just doing it for the cash grab to then fleece their followers, fleece their investors, and then move on to another project, right? Like I'm choosing to believe that. Maybe in 10 years, I won't be as ignorant. I don't know. Uh, but I feel like for now, I'm like, all right, I think there are probably some that deserve a little attention, but I think most of them are outright scams and cash grabs. And by the way, a lot of the altcoins that are produced by the same people. They just like they create one, they hype it up for a year or two, and then it dies, and then they move on to another one, and then they hype that one up for a year or two. So it's all the same thing, just rinsed and repeated over and over and over again. And the reality is that I think in 10 years, we're going to be looking back and being like, wow, why did we develop these cults around essentially what is nothing more than back office software for a lot of these altcoins, that most people could create if they had a developer background. So I think most are scams. Most are going to zero. Not all of them. I think the way to be safe in crypto is just keep most of your portfolio in Bitcoin. And if you want to branch out, you can. But altcoins are short-term trades. They're not long-term trades because over the long term, everything bleeds to Bitcoin.
Yeah. So they're a net positive or net negative for Bitcoin itself?
I mean I think they're negative in the sense that they call that like a lot of people end up buying them instead of Bitcoin because they think, this entire cycle I had to convince people that Bitcoin was a better buy than a lot of altcoins. They were like, well, if I buy Bitcoin, I'm only going to do a 5 to 10x. But if I buy these alts, I'm going to go up 100x. The problem is most of the alts they bought just went to zero or went down 80 to 90%. So I feel like I feel like a lot of them, I would say most of them have been a net negative to the space, especially all the meme coins stuff this cycle. All the people launching meme coins, I feel like that's been very negative for the space because to some degree, it kind of exposes the space for what it's turned into. And it's more of a casino, the last couple of years than anything else. And when the froth rises, Bitcoin usually gets a correction. So I think most of them have been negative. I think there have been a few of them have been positive, but I would say overwhelmingly it's been negative, especially the meme coin launches of the last couple of years.
I mean, the biggest problem with them is not knowing which one to pick, right? I mean, but with Bitcoin, you know obviously that there's only one Bitcoin, but
Exactly.
with
Right.
altcoins,
So like,
you can't.
right, why not sleep better at night and just get Bitcoin instead? Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. That's always my point as well when I talk to clients or friends. But some people have to go through this journey. Everybody has an altcoin journey, and some people learn it the hard way. Some people actually listen. I know people who actually listen and they go straight to multi-sig Bitcoin only. But some people, they just want to play around and they're like, why are you such a maxi? Let me just play a little bit around. And
Right.
I'm quite sure this one will outperform Bitcoin. And I'm like, okay, do whatever you want. But I don't think that's going to happen, or the likelihood of being happen is completely out of your control. You just don't know if it's going to happen or not. And how do you know that the next altcoin is not going to outcompete your altcoin?
Right.
That's the other
And if it
problem,
does
right?
happen, they usually don't sell anyways. They usually just round trip the gains regardless. So that's what makes the altcoin market so difficult, right? Like it's not that you can't make money there. I mean, I've made a lot of money in altcoins over the last several years, right? But like it's just that they're not good long-term investments. They're no different than penny stocks in a sense. Like, like neither of us is claiming that you can't make money trading penny stocks, but like 99.9% of people that probably trade penny stocks do lose money. It's just that, do you really want to gamble uh, on being that tiny percentage that actually gets rich from it? Like most people don't. I think that's kind of like the sobering reality that a lot of people have figured out this cycle.
Let's switch the conversation a little bit to a more long-term view. What is your long-term view on Bitcoin in the next 4 to 5 years? What's your base case, bull case, bear case?
I think the base case just has to be that like the 4-year cycle continues, and we're in a bear market now, and that's just the way it goes. Like, I mean, it's just this is what always happens. Bitcoin always tops out in Q4 of the post-halving year, and then it bottoms about a year later. Um, that's kind of how it's always worked, and it just seems like that should be the base case. I'm open-minded to it being slightly different. Like if it follows 2019, Bitcoin maybe could bottom earlier rather than waiting until all the way in October. Even last cycle, MicroStrategy bottomed in May and then it swept the low in December. So it's possible that Bitcoin could bottom lower. Um, so I would say the base case is just we're in a bear market. We find the low in 2026, sometime in 2026, and then we build off of it into the next bull market. That's the base case. Um, I guess the bull case in the short term would be if you look at Nvidia's stock price, um, or you look at, let me pull it up so people actually know what I'm talking about. Um, so if you look at like Nvidia's stock price, you'll see that it had a slightly higher high, and then it swept the low, and then after doing that, it went to a new high, right? If you look at Google, you can see it did the same thing, right? Like it had a slightly higher high, and then it swept the low, and then it went to a new all-time high. So the bull case is just, all right, well, Bitcoin had a slightly higher high. What if it sweeps this low, right? Like if Bitcoin sweeps this low, could it lead to a new all-time high? Uh, maybe, right? I think that the best time for a counter trend rally to a new all-time high would not even occur until after it sweeps this low, right? That's what I think. And I'm leaning more towards what happened in 2019 where it had a low and then it had a high and then eventually it swept this low right here but then it just led to a lower high and then a lower low. And so I think there's a scenario where in the bull case where like Bitcoin does something like this where it like fades down here and then bounces and then comes down to the 200-week moving average. Like that's what I think's going to happen. Um, but like there is a chance, maybe 20 to 30% chance that instead it like gets that pullback and then it just kind of goes up like Nvidia and Google did. And then you start looking at, and then if that happens, then you start looking at like this broadening wedge pattern or something, like where it's kind of following this. The issue though that I would have with that is that would be really great in the short term, but in the long term, I think it would actually be very, very bearish. Uh, one of the nice things about the 4-year cycle is that it kind of resets everything and allows, it just allows good entries in the market. It allows a lot of the froth to get left out and die.
But Ben, why do you think that would be bearish if that would happen? Just to follow up on that, why do you think the wedge that you just showed would be a bearish thing for Bitcoin
Yeah, because like if you look
if it did happen
Yeah,
that way?
because if you look at like the S&P 500 divided by M2, like it's basically following almost exactly what it did in 1996 to 2000, where if you take a bar pattern from 96 to the dot-com peak, it's almost a carbon copy of what the S&P 500 is doing now, right? So like if we continue to follow this pattern, basically like if the S&P kind of falls back down into early 2026 and then goes up again into late 2026, if Bitcoin were to follow that, I would be concerned that valuations are getting too stretched, and that we're gonna get like this like massive crash on the other side of it. And then also too, if you look at the S&P 500 divided by gold, the same level that the S&P keeps almost breaking down from against gold is the same level that it broke down from back in the 70s, right? Where once it broke down, it then led into a massive, these like basically back-to-back recessions. Um, and so like I think that by getting a sentiment shift by becoming bearish in 2026, if the markets were to become bearish and we can sort of get this reset in sentiment, I think that the 4-year cycle could still theoretically, be intact, and it would make me more bullish going into 2027 and 2028. But if we don't, and there's not a bear market, and instead we just kind of go back up to all-time highs, I think it's going to lead to a lot of chasing by people, and they're going to chase Bitcoin higher and higher. And it would be great in the short term, but I do think it would lead to sort of a massive crash on the other side of it. So I would actually prefer for the bearish sentiment to remain through at least the summer. So something like this, where it comes down, bounces, and then down. And I feel like it'd be a lot easier to get bullish on that. If it goes up again, I would start to maybe worry more about this like S&P M2 correlation from 20 something years ago, where it basically followed this exact same pattern.
Interesting, because usually what I hear from everyone is that if it breaks actually the 4-year cycle, they see it as a bullish sign, but you see it more like a bearish sign in this case.
Yeah, I would say because I think it would just lead to gross speculation and yeah, I would see it as a big crash coming on the other side of that. I mean, it would be great. It would be
Okay.
great in the short term, um, but I don't think it'd be great in the long term.
But Ben, what do you think about, for example, the argument about the ETFs? Like we didn't have the ETFs in the past cycles, right? We have now the ETFs. If you look at gold, for example, I think the ETFs for gold came in 2004. We just had a grind up and up and up in gold. We obviously had bear markets, but over the long term, it just went up all the time. I mean, why not compare Bitcoin to gold, but to the S&P in this case against gold?
Because Bitcoin doesn't trade like gold, and it never has. It's always traded like a risk on asset, not a risk off asset,
Mhm.
right? Like And I know people want to say it trades like gold, it's digital gold, but it is never traded like gold. That's a good thing because for the last 15 years, gold has underperformed. Only until recently it started outperforming. Most of the time, stocks outperform risk-off assets. Like, markets generally go up and to the right. But the reality is like we can't look at the ETF and say that that's going to save us. I mean, if you look at the QQQ, when the QQQ launched in 1999, we also went up, and then it still led to a massive crash despite having an ETF, right? That tracked despite having a fund that essentially tracked these tech stocks, it still didn't stop a massive crash from occurring. Um, so like I mean, the good news for Bitcoin is that like this move didn't take place um it's not exactly the same thing where you have this move up as quickly and then a macro lower high, but there are some things that kind of look like that, right? Like I mean, if we're being honest, right, like MicroStrategy looks like that, but to be fair to MicroStrategy, it also looked like that last cycle too, and then it ended up recovering. So, I think it'd be better just to have a normal 4-year cycle and just kind of get it over with. See, if you look at MicroStrategy prices, you can see that it had sort of a high and then a lower high, and so you could have argued it was going to follow the QQQ, but the main difference is that we didn't get a recession in 2022 or 2023, right? Now we're going through the same pattern again, right? I mean, it's almost the exact same setup, actually. Like if you overlay it, right, it's almost the exact same thing. Um, so I mean, I think the way it works out is that like if if we don't get a recession, and it's like 2022, then the markets can bottom a lot earlier. If you get a recession, which hopefully we don't, but if you do, then you could see a more prolonged crash by these like riskier things. Um, but I don't know. I mean, I think right now I'm just sort of in the camp of like I think it's going to play out like 2019, where it's just kind of a slow bleed for a little while.
Very interesting. What do you think about all the other narratives besides the data on the charts? For example, the FUD that is going around about the quantum threat on Bitcoin. Do you think that's going to change a lot in the next 4 to 5 years if anything changes there?
I don't think so. I mean, people have asked me about that since 2017, and I mean, if I'd worried about it, I would have missed out on a lot of gains. So I'm not saying it won't ever be an issue, but I feel like there's other issues to worry about first, right? Like the other stuff that's more pertinent to worry about is like the macro economy, right? Like, can the unemployment rate stop going up so much, and can we get things under control? I mean, company earnings and company profits are still not contracting, so that's a good thing. I think that stuff is worth more of our time than quantum.
100% agreed. I also hate that FUD that people talk about. What would change your mind though, Ben? If like, what would have to happen to Bitcoin that you would change your mind? You would say, okay, this is completely different this time around. It's not following the same pattern that it used to because I don't know. We have massive adoption around the globe. We have treasury companies popping out of nowhere all the time. We have nation states buying a lot of Bitcoin and they just nonstop buy it and it just keeps going up. Would that change your mind, or do you think that's completely
I
unrealistic and
I, I think
it's out of
I
it?
think narrative follows price, not the other way around, because like basically everything you just said, you could have said a year ago, right? You could have said that we have these treasury companies and we've got all these people buying Bitcoin, and we have the ETFs, and this time is different, and yet Bitcoin's the same price it was a year ago, right? So it's hard to put a lot of weight for me into those arguments, because if they were actually true and held water, like, well, why is Bitcoin not 2 to 3 times higher than it was a year ago? So I think that would be my biggest counterpoint to it.
Did that disappoint you actually this year, the performance?
I mean, like, I think like the ROI is still realistic. Like, I mean, it was diminishing returns. Um,
Mhm.
I don't think it's that hard to be upset. I mean, I think it's a function of diminishing returns, and we need to accept it.
Agreed. Good. Perfect. Ben, I have one more for you and then I'm gonna let you go. It's a fun one. Are you secretly a Bitcoin maxi?
I would say, I mean, like I definitely lean towards the maxi um way, right? But I feel like I also don't want to like alienate people as well. Like I mean like the reality is like I have made a lot of money in altcoins in the past. And so like I don't want to sit up here and then like have that be my past and then be like, all right, but you guys aren't allowed to make money in altcoins, even though I did. Um, so like I want to be open-minded because like, back then I used to take on more risk. I think one of the things is that um the older you get and the more experience you have and the more and sort of the more wealth that you generate, like I think the older you are, you sort of want to just preserve what you have, rather than try to, because the thing is if you only have a few $100s, it doesn't really matter. I mean, if you go YOLO it on an altcoin, like if it goes to zero, like who cares? Like
Cares.
you can go make
Yeah.
that back, and if you're in your 20s, you got, a long time to make up for that. If you're in your if you're older and you've accumulated wealth, are you really ever going to put enough money into an altcoin to even care? Right? Like even if even if you bought a meme coin and it went up 100x, like are you ever going to have put enough money in the first place for it to even matter to you? Probably not, because you don't want to, you know how hard you worked for that money to begin with, and you're not just going to want to go throw it away on meme coins that you're just enriching the founder for. Um, so I do think that like I do think people would be more successful in crypto if they just adopted the maxi approach. Uh,
Yes.
Generally speaking, like I think that, and that's kind of the approach that I've given this cycle, is just like just stick with Bitcoin, and you're going to be better off. The only other thing besides Bitcoin that I bought this cycle was Ethereum, and I didn't buy that until April when I thought it was bottoming against Bitcoin. Uh, and I mean, there was some nice gains there, but I mean, overall, I think, like I can like certain stocks, but that doesn't mean I can't go buy other stocks, right? Like I like Apple, I like Google, I like Microsoft, right? I mean, I like these stocks. I like Tesla, but I mean, I'm not like an Apple maxi or a Tesla maxi, right? I'm a I want to figure out where the bull market is and make money on it. I don't care if it's Bitcoin, I don't care if it's gold, I don't care if it's Apple, right? It doesn't matter to me what it is. I just want to identify what it is. And for the last 4 years, it has not been altcoins. And it might be altcoins again at some point in the future, but it has not been that. And I don't think it's going to be that for a while.
So you define Bitcoin maxi in the cryptoverse, as you call it, being Bitcoin only or Bitcoin plus altcoins. But my definition is a little bit different. So I also include other assets against Bitcoin being a Bitcoin maxi or not. So do you own other assets other than Bitcoin outside of crypto?
Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. So what would a balanced portfolio look like for you?
I mean, I have a mixture of index funds, Bitcoin, gold, silver, palladium, uranium. I have bonds, but not many. I think like my portfolio is like 1% bonds because I'm not like I kind of think the Fed's going to try to run things hot and it's just going to lead to the long end going higher. So I'm not really that interested in bonds. I have a little bit of real estate, but it's mostly just for personal use. I actually own more stocks than Bitcoin than crypto. Like I own more index funds than crypto. Probably about like 3 times as much actually. Um, and the reality is like I don't, if Bitcoin drops 50%, like well that means stocks are down 10 or 20%, you know. Um, I take on more risk at different times. Like I have more metals now than like I grew my like in 2019 my portfolio was only like 5% metals, right? But now it's closer to like 15 to 20%. Um, just because I thought we were, a couple of years ago, I thought we were going to go into a metals bull market. Um, so yeah, I mean, it just varies depending on when you ask. I do think there's rationale for going into 2026 with at least some cash, because even in the scenario that Bitcoin puts in an all-time high, it'll probably sweep the low first, if I had to guess. Like it'll probably go below 75K before going to a new all-time high, would be my base case. Um, so yeah, that's where I am.
Interesting. I didn't expect that answer, to be honest. I thought you would have more exposure in Bitcoin or crypto than anything else.
Also,
What
I'd
would
also
what
sold like
yes?
I also sold off a decent amount of of crypto like back in October, November as well, because like I thought we were in a bear market, you know? Um like I don't want to hold like a ton of my net worth in an asset class if I think we're in a bear market.
Yes. Like, could you imagine becoming a Michael Saylor in your life at some point, and just because he's a very extreme guy, right? He's like, this is an engineering breakthrough. This is the answer. I'm gonna own this, and I'm not gonna own anything else. Is there anything that could change your mind to become like that in Bitcoin?
No.
No,
No, because as much as I
no.
believe in Bitcoin and as much as I love it, there are idiosyncratic risks associated with it that I can't control, right? Like what happens if some of the FUD that we think is just FUD ends up being true one day? You know, like I don't want to risk my entire family's like our money. Like I don't want to risk everything on one thing. Like that just I feel like it's not what I would want to do. I think risking a certain percentage of it makes sense. But like I would never have everything in one asset. Um and I mean, you know, I think that makes me different in some ways to a lot of the people in crypto. Um like in bull markets, I certainly make a lot of money, but I'm not making as much as if I was just 100% exposed to Bitcoin. But it also does protect in case there is the downside. I mean the reality is even MicroStrategy in the dot-com bust dropped a ton, right? Like I mean it did. Uh,
Yes.
Actually, if I look at it right now in the dot-com crisis, I mean MicroStrategy dot dropped 99.87%, right? So it always sounds good in a bull market, right? Like it always sounds good and it sounds obvious, but all it takes is the market doing something that none of us have experienced because we're too young. Like I mean, I'm 35, right? Like I've never experienced a true slowdown in the economy before, at least as an investing adult. I hope it never happens, right? I hope it never does, but the reality is it's going to happen at some point. And when it happens, I don't want all my eggs in one basket.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But I really didn't expect that answer, because usually when I speak to people being in the space for long enough, they have more exposure. That's very interesting. Ben, really pleasure having you on. Thanks for taking the time. And I hope to speak to you soon again.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Thanks. Thanks for coming on. Take care.